Morning, -18 degrees. Wind speed around 80 kilometers per hour. Inside a 14-story building on the Alaskan coast, 272 people wake up. This is not a hotel and not a military barracks. It's an entire town under a single roof. Residents take the elevator down to the shop, ride up to the doctor, and walk their children to school through an underground tunnel. Outside on this day, the wind knocks you off your feet and the snow piles up to your waist. This town is called Whittier. It's the first of a family of places we'll look into today. Each of them stands somewhere that is either unbearably cold, or has no air, or doesn't even have ground beneath your feet. By the finale, we'll reach a settlement out in the middle of the open sea, 86 kilometers from the nearest shore. Thousands of people lived there without a single square meter of land beneath them. What made humans choose to live in places nature created for non-life? The answer turns out to be the same for all 7 cities, and it arrives only at the very end. Whittier sits on the southern coast of Alaska, roughly 100 kilometers from Anchorage. As the crow flies, that's comparable to the distance from Moscow to Tula. But reaching Whittier by land is only possible through a single tunnel bored 4 kilometers straight through a mountain. During the day, this tunnel lets cars pass in one direction at a time. At night, it shuts completely. Miss the closing time, and you either sleep outside or wait for morning. The United States Army began building a military port here during the Second World War. They needed a deep harbor shielded by mountains from air raids. In the 1950s, the Army put up a 14-story barracks called the Hodge Building. After the military pulled out, the building passed to civilians and was renamed Begich Towers. Today, 272 people live in Whittier, and almost all of them live inside this one building. Within Begich Towers, you'll find the cozy corner store, the post office, and the police. Other floors hold a clinic, a small Baptist church, and an indoor playground. A heated corridor runs from the building to the school, so children never have to step out into the wind. Why is all of this packed into a single structure? Whittier gets 5 meters of precipitation a year, an outright record among U.S. towns. Half the year it snows, half the year it rains, and the winter Gulf wind reaches 96 kilometers per hour. One resident, Brenda Toman, keeps 2 reindeer on her property. One winter, the snow drifted higher than 4 meters beside the fence, and the reindeer simply stepped over it and wandered off into the mountains. The town's logic is simple. When the weather is unlivable, hide inside one sturdy building and live within it for years. But what happens when the problem outside isn't cold, but the opposite? Heat so fierce that even the walls of an ordinary house can no longer hold it back. In the Australian desert at Coober Pedy, the thermometer hit 53.9 degrees in January 1960. At a temperature like that, an aluminum mug heats up enough to hurt your hand. An ordinary summer day here shows 40 to 45 degrees in the shade. Red dust from decades of mining hangs permanently over the town. Instead of the rooftops you'd expect, hundreds of white ventilation pipes poke up out of the ground. In 1915, a teenager named Willie Hutchison found opal here. Prospectors arrived from all over the world, and it quickly became clear that living on the surface was impossible. They started living right inside the rock, carving rooms and corridors into the hillsides. Inside a dugout, the temperature stays around 24 degrees all year round, with no air conditioning at all. The sandstone walls absorb the noise, the dust, and the sharp swings in temperature alike. Today, about 2,500 people live in Coober Pedy, more than half of them underground. The town's Serbian Orthodox church is carved entirely out of the rock. There's an underground hotel, an underground museum, and even an underground cemetery. A 3-bedroom house costs roughly the same as an ordinary home above ground, only without the electricity bills. While the desert melts up top, it stays cool and quiet below. But what if a person's enemy is no longer heat, nor cold, nor even the ground, but the very air being breathed? In one city on the slopes of the Andes, there's half the normal amount of air, and yet tens of thousands of people live there anyway. It stands at the foot of the Anania Glacier in the Peruvian Andes, at an altitude of 5,100 meters above sea level, higher than any point in the Alps except the very summit of Mont Blanc. At that height, the air holds half as much oxygen as it does at sea level. A visitor spends the first day flat on their back with a headache and nausea. To adjust and move around normally takes roughly a month of acclimatization. Locals born here carry significantly more red blood cells than lowland Peruvians. Beneath the city lies a major gold deposit. Between 2001 and 2009, the price of gold roughly tripled. Within 10 years, the population more than doubled. Nobody designed the city. La Rinconada has no sewage system, no running water, and no public dump. The pay system is called the cachorreo. A miner works 30 days straight without wages. On the 31st day, he's allowed to carry away as much ore as he can lift on his own back. How much gold is in that ore, nobody knows in advance. It's a lottery played with one's health, and often with one's life. The ground beneath the city is soaked with mercury, and the groundwater is poisoned. The average miner lives just 30 to 35 years. The people who live here know this, and they keep coming all the same. The average miner in La Rinconada lives just 30 to 35 years, about half the lifespan of an average Peruvian. Altitude robs a person of air, but in the next city, there's no solid ground underfoot at all. In Lagos, Nigeria's largest city, there's a district called Makoko. It sits beside the third mainland bridge, which links Lagos Island to the mainland. To the left rise the skyscrapers and yachts of wealthy Ikoyi. To the right stand wooden huts on stilts. Estimates put the population somewhere between 85,000 and 300,000. The settlement was founded by Igun fishermen in the 19th century to be closer to the fish. In the waterborne part of Makoko, there are simply no streets. In their place is water, about 1.5 meters deep. Children paddle to school by canoe. That's their ordinary school bus. Traders move across the water, selling bread, vegetables, and drinking water. Makoko has a floating school designed by architect Kunle Adeyemi. There's no sewage system whatsoever, so all waste drops into the same lagoon where residents catch their fish. Only 7% of Makoko's residents hold legal title to their land. The Lagos authorities have tried for years to demolish the district. The first push came in 2005, the second in 2012. Between December 2025 and February 2026, authorities tore down hundreds of stilt houses with floating excavators under police guard. Around 30,000 people were left homeless in those 2 months. When there's no solid ground beneath your feet, a person builds it themselves and keeps building even beneath the excavators. But in the next city, there's no solid ground underfoot at all, and no water either, just open sea. The next city faced exactly the opposite problem. Just 4.5 hectares of land for 5,000 people. 15 kilometers from Nagasaki in the East China Sea lies a tiny outcrop of rock, 480 meters long and about 160 meters wide. Its shape resembles a Japanese warship, which earned the islet the nickname Gunkanjima. In 1890, the Mitsubishi conglomerate bought the island from Japan's imperial government. Coal was found beneath the rock, at the time the main fuel of industry, and the mines ran hundreds of meters down beneath the seabed. In 1916, Mitsubishi's engineers put up Japan's first multi-story reinforced concrete apartment block. By the 1950s, the island had hardened into a dense concrete cube. The buildings stood flush against one another, leaving only narrow staircases and walkways between them. In 1959, the population peaked at 5,259 people, a density of roughly 83,000 people per square kilometer. The island had a school, a hospital, a cinema, a public bathhouse, 2 temples, and several bars. There was no drinking water on the rock. It was piped in from the mainland through an undersea line. There was no soil for plants, so residents hauled earth up to the rooftops in pots and made tiny gardens. In January 1974, Mitsubishi announced the mine's closure. Japan had switched from coal to oil. Within 3 months, every resident had left the island, abandoning furniture, toys, and dishes still in the cupboards. The gaps between the buildings were so narrow that sunlight barely reached the lower floors. Today, Hashima stands empty. The concrete walls crumble and slabs fall onto the narrow streets inside. Tourists are allowed only onto a specially reinforced path. The city, whose density once set a world record, has become the densest patch of ruins on the planet. That density seemed impossible, yet another city beat it more than 15-fold. Not in Japan, but in Hong Kong. In the 19th century, Britain took Hong Kong from China in the aftermath of the Opium Wars, but the Chinese kept one small scrap of land for themselves: the old military fort of Kowloon, measuring just 210 by 120 meters. After the Second World War, refugees from mainland China poured into this legal gap. The British police couldn't drive them out because of Chinese jurisdiction, and the Chinese police never set foot in the British zone. The refugees began to build, stacking one house on top of another, with no architects, no permits, and no blueprints. By the 1980s, some 350 buildings stood inside the fort, fused together by their roofs and connecting passages. Residents could walk across the upper floors for days without ever coming down to the ground. By 1987, 33,000 people lived inside the fort, a density of 1,255,000 people per square kilometer. Inside Kowloon, there was no law. Unlicensed dentists, underground noodle factories, opium dens, brothels, and martial arts schools. Sunlight never reached the lower floors. Fluorescent lamps burned around the clock in the corridors. Water trickled down the walls from dozens of homemade pipes, laid with no engineering logic whatsoever. Photographer Greg Girard and Ian Lambert spent 4 years inside Kowloon, producing the photo book City of Darkness. In 1987, the Hong Kong government decided to demolish the fort. Residents were paid 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars in compensation altogether. Demolition began in March 1993 and finished in April 1994. The 350 buildings that grew up without a single engineer disappeared in 14 months. Today, the site is a public park, Kowloon Walled City Park, with gardens and a museum. A world record of 1,255,000 people per square kilometer, the absolute peak of human density in history. The 350 buildings that grew without a single engineer disappeared in 14 months. And the world record they held has never been broken. All 6 cities shared one thing. Beneath them was land, rock, or at least the floor of a shallow lagoon. But what happens when someone decides to build a real city where there is nothing at all? Only open sea, tens of meters deep. In 1948, Soviet planners carried out a deep survey of the Caspian Sea, 86 kilometers from Baku. On November 7, 1949, a crew led by drilling foreman Mikhail Kavarochkin struck the first oil, around 100 tons a day from a kilometer down. The well stood on a lone metal derrick in the middle of the open sea. Soviet engineers took 7 old decommissioned ships and deliberately sank them at the chosen spot. The hulls settled onto the seabed and formed an artificial reef. Onto this, they piled earth, stone, and scrap metal. They ringed the platform with steel piles driven into the seabed, welded walkways to the piles, and set pumping stations on the walkways. And so the core of the future city was born, named Oil Rocks. By 1958, 9-story dormitories for workers stood on the piles. By the late 1970s, there were a bakery, a cinema, a clinic, a lemonade workshop, and a park with real trees. The soil for the park and the football pitch was carried over from shore by barge. Bridges on steel piles were built over the sea between the platforms. By the 1970s, the total length exceeded 300 kilometers. Stretched into a single line, they'd reach from Moscow to Bryansk. At its 1960s peak, the city held around 5,000 people. Drinking water came from shore through 2 undersea pipes, 350 millimeters in diameter. The city had its own postal address and its own bus network running on the elevated roadways. Swiss filmmaker Mark Wolfensberger spent 8 years obtaining permission and called Oil Rocks the 8th wonder of the world. The city still operates today. SOCAR pumps roughly 1 million tons of oil a year from it. About 2,000 people live on the rocks today, working in rotating shifts. But the city is slowly losing to the Caspian. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, There was no one left to maintain 300 kilometers of bridges. Many platforms are abandoned, and many stretches of the causeways have collapsed into the water. On the 4th of December 2015, during a storm, part of a residential block tore loose and fell into the sea. 3 SOCAR workers went missing without trace that night. Of the 300 kilometers of roads, only about 45 kilometers remain in working order today. Meter by meter, the Caspian is taking back what humans once won from it. A city built with no precedent, no blueprint, on nothing but open water. Mark Wolfensberger called it the 8th wonder of the world, and he wasn't wrong. Meter by meter, the Caspian is taking back what humans once won from it. And the city endures. 7 cities, 7 different impossibilities for living. 1 building against the wind, burrows against the desert heat, altitude against the air itself, stilts against the lagoon, concrete against the absence of land, chaos against the law, and 300 kilometers of bridges against the open sea. All these places share one trait. Not one of them would have appeared if a resource hadn't been lying right beside it. Coal beneath Hiroshima, opal at Kuber Poti, gold at La Rinconada, oil beneath the Caspian, a military port at Whittier, fish in the Lagos Lagoon, a legal loophole at Kowloon. A person never chooses an unbearable place for no reason. They choose it when something underfoot is worth staying for. As soon as that resource runs out or loses value, the strange city begins to fall apart. Hiroshima emptied in 3 months. Kowloon was demolished in 14. Oil rocks is now slipping under the water, meter by meter, with every storm. A city lives exactly as long as people have a reason to stay in it. When the reason disappears, all that's left is the sea, the wind, and empty concrete walls. If you found this interesting, share it with anyone who loves strange places. There are many more stories ahead about how people make a home out of what nature never meant to be lived in.